The fanatical resistance of the Japanese in World War II is one of the most powerful features of that war. Their fearless desire to die to the last man was extraordinary. This inflicted huge casualties on the advancing Americans. But how much more fanatical would that resistance have been had Japan itself been invaded? Today we will learn about the Japanese plan for what to do had Japan itself been invaded, and what it would have meant for millions of lives. This is Knowledge Voyage. Japan had carved out an impressively large empire in early World War II, so large it could comfortably fit the territory the Germans occupied inside of it. However, at Midway, Japan suffered a critical defeat, and from that point on, America's superior military, industrial and tactical advantages were ruthlessly brought to bear. It was felt that Japan could be defeated by capturing its island colonies. This would deprive Japan of the natural resources it needed to power its industry and continue the war. Japan itself lacked these resources, so cutting off the supply would starve Japan's war potential. As the war went on, it became increasingly clear Japan would never give up, regardless of how illogical fighting on with no resources was. This meant Japan itself would need to be invaded. This was very worrying, because as the US military got closer and closer to Japan itself, the resistance became that much more fanatical, with US casualties mounting in response. At Iwo Jima, around 20,000 Americans were killed or wounded, and at Okinawa, about 50,000 Americans were killed or wounded. As much as 1/3 of the civilian population of the islands died in these attacks as well. In March 1945, the US captured the island of Iwo Jima as the last phase of its pre-invasion plans. The US Navy launched a campaign of naval warfare to strangle Japan's supplies by sea, but they still didn't give in. Japan's once proud navy had been all but destroyed by the US. The battles of Saipan and Iwo Jima meant that US bombers were now within range of Japan itself, and US bombers reduced Japan's major cities to rubble. This naval blockade and ceaseless bombing was softening Japan up for eventual ground invasion. The US plan was in two parts. The first was called Operation Olympic, which would involve an invasion of the island of Kyushu in the south of Japan. This would be used as a staging post for the next wave. The second wave was codenamed Operation Coronet, and would see the invasion of the Tokyo Bay and Kanto Plain area. This would involve 40 divisions of troops, nearly 4 times higher than D-Day, and would involve fighting in the most heavily populated part of Japan. The US government estimated casualties would be severe. Around 400,000 Americans were expected to die in Operation Olympic. Just 1/2 of a 2-stage invasion of Japan would generate the same number of Americans who had already died in the whole of World War II up to this point. The US government anticipated these mass casualties and minted hundreds of thousands of Purple Heart medals in preparation. After the Battle of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the Japanese knew beyond any doubt that Japan itself would be next. The Japanese army came up with a plan to counter the invaders in one last-ditch mass action. This plan, Japan's last gasp, was codenamed Operation Ketsugo, which means decisive action. Ketsugo would have involved concentrating Japanese army divisions in the southern island of Kyushu. This was accurately guessed at as the Allies' preferred landing site for their own plan, Operation Olympic. If the Japanese army concentrated the bulk of its forces here, the fighting would have been especially brutal. Japanese civilians would also form militias known as Kokumin Gyo Sentotai, or Volunteer Fighting Corps. These militias would carry out partisan attacks against the American invaders. This would support the regular Japanese army's efforts. Japan's high birth rate in the years before World War II meant Japan had an unusually large population of young people to serve as partisans, like these schoolgirls. Ketsugo would have also seen mass kamikaze wave attacks launched against the invaders' ships. Kamikaze attacks had already destroyed dozens of US ships, and killed or wounded nearly 10,000 sailors by this stage of the war. Commander of the kamikaze force on Kyushu, Matomo Ugaki, had also shifted tactics and training to make kamikazes more lethal. At the Battle of Okinawa, kamikazes had been trained to target capital ships like aircraft carriers or destroyers, but now that they were being trained to aim at transport ships and troop landing craft. This would mean kamikaze attacks would have been more casualty effective than their previous attacks. Furthermore, the Japanese were confident their hit rate of 1 plane in 9 hitting a target could be increased to 1 in 6. This was because Kyushu was more favourable to defenders than Okinawa had been. There were also plans for suicide boats and torpedoes. Ketsugo would have also seen the mass execution of all Allied prisoners of war in Japan once the Allied invasion began. There were around 80,000 Allied prisoners of war in Japan at the time, mostly British and Commonwealth troops, but also over 14,000 Americans. 100 million proudly die was a government slogan, calling on Japan's entire population to be willing to die to the last man against the Americans at Ketsugo. Japanese government propaganda kept the population on edge, filling the airwaves with lurid tales of mass atrocities by American troops if they were to lose. The Japanese army had managed to inspire fanatical resistance among civilians in Okinawa and Saipan, by whipping them up about a fear of alleged American atrocities if they lost. Over 1,000 civilians on Saipan, including women holding babies in their arms, committed suicide by jumping off cliffs in the face of American invasion. The Allies had been working on the atomic bomb for some time, but its complexity and cost meant it was a slow project. But by July 1945 it was ready, and the first ever nuclear bomb was successfully exploded at the Trinity test site in New Mexico. Truman informed the Allied leaders at Potsdam the bomb was ready. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was bombed with a nuclear bomb. The city was annihilated and 70,000 people died, with a similar number injured. The Japanese didn't respond, so 3 days later, the Americans hit them again, this time bombing the port city of Nagasaki. Truman explained in a radio address on the day Nagasaki was attacked that, "We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans. We shall continue to use it until we completely destroy Japan's power to make war. Only a Japanese surrender will stop us." This time, the Japanese did get the message. Japan's whole strategic aim had been to get the Americans to invade Japan and then gruesomely inflict high casualties until they no longer wanted to carry through the invasion and instead sue for peace. But the atomic bomb meant the Americans could kill limitless Japanese and do so at will since Japan's air defense was all but gone by this stage of the war. As Hirohito mentioned in his famous radio address announcing the Japanese surrender, on August the 15th, Japan surrendered. According to author Richard Frank in his book Downfall, estimates that losses would have been colossal had Ketsugo gone ahead. Secretary of War Henry Stimson estimated that around 800,000 Americans would have died had Ketsugo gone ahead, and between 2 and 4 million Americans wounded. It is also estimated that between 5 and 10 million Japanese would have also died. So many Purple Hearts were minted for the invasion of Japan that there were enough to be handed out in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, 70 years later. The 2 atomic bombs, which killed 180,000 people, stopped Ketsugo, which would have taken 11 million lives. So it looks like the decision to bomb Japan with nukes was the best thing to do after all. Thanks for watching everyone. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you.